In the brutal winter of the Arizona frontier, a compassionate nurse, cast aside by the world, faced the cold alone, not knowing a single act of mercy was about to rewrite her destiny. Watch till the end to uncover the truth. Tell us where you're watching from. If these Western stories move you, share them, and subscribing helps us keep bringing new stories to life, partner.
The wind didn't just blow through the mountain pass of Oakhaven. It screamed. It was December of 1890, and the Arizona high country was locked in a crystalline, unforgiving frost that turned breath into ghosts and fingers into ice. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of more snow, and the shadows of the towering pines stretched like jagged teeth across the frozen earth. At the edge of the train platform sat Ella Thorne. She was 28 years old, though the hollows under her eyes suggested a woman who had seen a century's worth of suffering. She sat perfectly still, a stark contrast to the swirling chaos of the storm. Clutched between her knees was a heavy, battered leather Gladstone bag, the sum total of her life's work and her only remaining possession. Inside were a few surgical tools, a tattered medical text, a change of clothes, and a dried rose from her mother's funeral 3 years prior. For 6 years the Oakhaven Infirmary had been her sanctuary. She had slept in a cot in the back room, breathed the sharp, stinging scent of carbolic acid, and dedicated her hands to the stitched wounds and fevered brows of the town's inhabitants. But Ella possessed a flaw that the hospital board, led by the miserly Dr. Sterling, could no longer tolerate. She had a habit of forgetting to log the debts of the miners' wives and the orphan's stable hands. She had used her own meager wages to buy quinine for those who had nothing but copper pennies in desperation. That morning Sterling had handed her a final paycheck, docked for the supplies she had stolen for the poor, and told her to be gone by sunset. "Medicine is a business, Miss Thorne," he had sneered, his spectacles reflecting the cold light. "Not a charity for the shiftless." With her parents long since buried in the dry earth of the East, Ella had nowhere to turn. She sat on the splintering wooden bench, watching the red lanterns of the last southbound train vanish into the snowy gloom. She had missed it by mere minutes. She was a woman of science and iron will, but as the temperature plummeted and the station master locked the doors for the night, the first cracks of despair began to spiderweb through her heart. The stranger in the storm, the rhythmic thud of hooves against the frozen mud, broke the silence of the station. Out of the swirling white dark emerged a silhouette that seemed carved from the mountains themselves. He rode a massive charcoal-colored stallion, his long duster coat stiff with rime. This was Caleb Vance. At 35, Caleb was a man of significant means, but even more significant silences. A year ago, the light had gone out of his world when a merciless winter fever had taken his wife, Sarah, leaving him master of a sprawling cattle empire but prisoner of a hollow house. Since then, restlessness had become his shadow. On nights when the walls of his ranch felt like a tomb, he rode into town, a silent sentinel, looking for anyone the world had tried to discard. It was a penance for a man who felt his wealth had failed to buy the only thing that mattered: a cure. He pulled the reins, the stallion huffing a cloud of steam that mingled with the falling snow. Caleb's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, locked onto the lonely figure on the bench. He didn't speak at first. He simply observed the way she held herself, shoulders squared, despite the shivering, chin tilted up as if defying the sky to drop more snow. "Madam," Caleb finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that cut through the wind. "The last coach for Phoenix left an hour ago. Sitting here much longer is a sure way to find a permanent bed in the churchyard." Ella looked up. She saw a man with a face like a weather-beaten map, rugged, scarred by loss, but with eyes that lacked the predatory glint she had come to expect from the powerful men of Oakhaven. "I am aware of the schedule, sir," she replied, her voice trembling slightly from the cold. "I am simply contemplating my next direction." Caleb dismounted, his boots crunching on the frosted boards. He took a step closer, but stayed at a respectful distance. "Contemplation won't keep the blood moving. This wind is a killer. I don't know your story, and I won't pry into it if you aren't willing to share. But I have a ranch 3 miles out with a hearth that hasn't gone cold in a decade. There is a guest cabin, warm and dry. Ella gripped the handle of her bag tighter. I have no way to pay for such hospitality, Mr. Vance. Caleb Vance, he said. He saw the pride in her eyes and adjusted his approach. And I'm not asking for coin. Some folks call it charity. I call it common sense. If I see a calf shivering in a blizzard, I bring it to the barn. I reckon a human soul deserves at least that much grace. Besides, they say those who help without greed find the same kindness returned when their own hour of need strikes. My hour of need was a year ago, and I remember well who turned their backs. The philosophy struck a chord so deep in Ella that she felt a physical ache. It was the very creed she had been fired for. She looked at his outstretched hand, gloved, steady, and offering a lifeline. Slowly she stood up, her joints popping in the cold. I will stay until morning, she whispered. No longer. The shelter of the high country. The ride to the Vance Ranch was a blur of silver moonlight and biting wind. Caleb insisted. She ride his stallion while he led the horse by the bridle, walking through the drifts to ensure she didn't slip. It was an act of chivalry that Ella, used to the dismissive arrogance of Dr. Sterling, found disorienting. When they arrived, the ranch was an imposing fortress of timber and stone, nestled against a backdrop of granite peaks. He led her into the main house, where a fire roared in a fireplace large enough to stand in. The smell of cedar smoke and aged leather filled the air. As the heat began to thaw Ella's frozen limbs, the wall of her reserve finally crumbled. Over a bowl of hot beef stew, the words spilled out. She told him about the infirmary, about the children she couldn't turn away, and the cold-hearted ledger books of Dr. Sterling. She told him about the parents she'd lost to the influenza of '87, and the terrifying realization that at 28, her usefulness to society was being stripped away because she dared to be compassionate. Caleb listened in a silence that was heavy with empathy. He watched the way her hands moved, the hands of a healer, steady even when her voice shook. He saw a purity of spirit that he thought had vanished from the frontier. The town thinks they've thrown you away, Ella, Caleb said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it sent a strange spark through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. But Oak Haven is a growing place. People are tired of Sterling's prices and his arrogance. They need someone who sees a patient, not a paycheck. I have no building, Caleb, no supplies, no standing, she sighed, leaning back into the warmth of the armchair. I have all of those things, he countered. The birth of the Mercy Clinic. The next morning, the world was a dazzling, blinding white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt holy. Ella prepared to leave, but Caleb stopped her at the door. He led her across the yard to a sturdy two-story outbuilding near the edge of his property that had once served as a land office for the ranch's expansion. I've spent the night thinking, Caleb said, stepping inside the dusty room. I'm going to renovate this. It'll have an exam room, 4 beds and a dispensary. You'll be the head of it. No boards, no Dr. Sterling, no ledgers if you don't want them. You treat who you see fit, and I'll see to the overhead. Ella shook her head, tears pricking her eyes. I cannot accept this. It's too much. It's an impossible gift. Caleb stepped closer, his presence commanding but gentle. It's not a gift, Ella. It's an investment in the kind of world I want to live in. I couldn't save my wife. No amount of cattle or gold could bring her back. Maybe, if there had been someone like you in this town a year ago, someone who cared more for the heartbeat than the coin, I wouldn't be eating dinner alone every night. Don't do it for me. Do it for the people who are sitting on that station bench right now, with nowhere to go. After hours of arguing, and Caleb's stubborn insistence, Ella finally relented. She realized that by refusing, she was letting her pride stand in the way of her calling. The months that followed were a whirlwind of grit and purpose. While Caleb's men hammered and sawed, Ella worked tirelessly to organize the clinic. Caleb used his connections to order the finest surgical instruments from Chicago and crates of medicine from the coast. Word spread like wildfire through the territory. There was a mercy nurse out at the Vance Ranch who wouldn't turn a soul away. One Tuesday, a group of miners arrived, carrying a comrade whose leg had been crushed in a cave-in. They had been turned away from the Oak Haven infirmary because they couldn't pay the upfront deposit. Ella worked for 6 hours, Caleb at her side holding the lanterns and assisting with the ether, until the man's leg was saved. Caleb was a constant presence. He didn't just provide the money, he provided the strength. He helped her lift heavy patients. He rode out in midnight storms to fetch her from distant homesteads when the mountain fever broke out, and he sat with her in the clinic during the long dark hours when a patient's life hung by a thread. The slow thaw of two hearts in the evenings. The ritual became their sanctuary. After the last patient had been tended to, and the clinic was quiet, Ella would walk across the snowy yard to the main house. They would sit at the long oak dining table, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across their faces. They talked of things beyond medicine and cattle, of books they had both read, of the changing frontier, and of the scars they both carried. Caleb spoke of Sarah, not with the sharp, jagged edge of fresh grief, but with a quiet, honored memory. Ella spoke of her dreams of a world where health wasn't a luxury for the rich. The tension between them grew, not out of sudden passion, but out of a slow-burning, profound respect. Ella saw the man behind the wealth, a man who used his power as a shield for the weak. Caleb saw the woman behind the medicine, a warrior who fought death with nothing but a needle and a prayer. One evening in late March, as the first hints of spring began to melt the mountain ice, the air was soft and smelled of damp earth. They were standing on the porch of the clinic, looking out over the valley. "You've changed this place, Ella," Caleb said. He turned to look at her, the moonlight catching the silver at his temples. "I used to ride at night because I was looking for a reason to keep going. I think I found it the moment I saw you on that bench. I just didn't know if I was man enough to keep you here." Ella looked into his eyes, seeing the man who had built her a world when hers had been destroyed. "I was waiting for a train to take me away," she whispered. "I didn't realize I was already home." There was no grand sweeping drama in his proposal. He simply took her hand, the hand that had healed so many, and asked if she would consider staying forever. Not just as the town's healer, but as his partner in everything. A simple union. The wedding took place in April, on a day when the wildflowers began to peek through the receding snow. It was a simple affair, held right there in the Mercy Clinic. They didn't want a grand cathedral or a fancy ballroom. They wanted to be surrounded by the walls that had given them both a second chance. The room was filled to capacity. There were miners in their best clean shirts, ranch hands who had ridden 20 miles to attend, and mothers holding healthy infants who wouldn't have been there if not for Ella's skill. Even the local baker, whose daughter Ella had saved from scarlet fever, had brought a 3-tiered cake that smelled of vanilla and honey. Ella wore a simple gown of cream-colored wool, cinched at the waist, with a sprig of mountain pine tucked into her hair. She carried no bouquet of hothouse flowers, only a cluster of local desert primroses. When Caleb took her hands, his voice was steady and clear. "I promise to stand by you in the storms, to build the fires when the world grows cold, and to honor the mercy you carry in your heart every day of my life." Ella's voice was a soft, sure resonance. "I promise to be your strength when yours falters, to fill this house with life, and to never let the fire of our shared purpose go out." The ceremony was brief, officiated by a circuit rider who had benefited from Ella's care. When they were pronounced husband and wife, a cheer went up that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. It wasn't just a celebration of a marriage, it was a celebration of a community that had found its heart. As the Arizona sun set over the mountains that evening, painting the snow in shades of violet and gold, the nurse and the rancher stood together on the porch of their home. The Mercy nurse and the man of silences had found a language all their own. They had both started in the cold, lonely, and discarded by fate, but they had built a fire, not just in a hearth, but in a valley, that would keep the entire territory warm for generations to come. They watched the stars blink into existence over Oakhaven, no longer afraid of the wind, for they knew that as long as they stood together, the screaming of the storm was nothing more than a lullaby.
If you really like our Western stories, your subscription and sharing means more to us than you think.